So, hold on. The great thing about this presentation is that, you know, all you need to do is Google UK trade policy and you can get some wonderful statements like this one from the UK Prime Minister. So, you know, as I was saying earlier, the starting point for, you know, for us is the fact that one of the key focuses of the UK government policy post-Brexit has been on the possibilities that, you know, leaving the European Union opens for the UK to develop its own independent trade policy, free from the constraints of the EU customs union and single market. And in this vein, of course, you know, you'll all remember that one of the first things that Theresa May did as Prime Minister following the Brexit referendum was to establish a Department for International Trade. And of course, you know, red lines that were subsequently articulated by May in her Lancaster House speech, which also became official government policy, were, you know, all about leaving the customs union and the single market to be able to pursue this ambitious trade policy. And it, of course, became also one of the main lines of critique of the withdrawal agreement as it was initially negotiated under May, right? The argument being that the Northern Irish backstop, particularly the all-UK customs union, would impede the UK from being able to exercise that independent trade policy. And so with Johnson, of course, what we saw was that a renegotiated withdrawal agreement, you know, saw the UK untethered from the EU customs union. And of course, that, you know, was one of the reasons why, you know, those Eurosceptics that opposed May's deal became quite enthused about the sort of adjusted Johnson withdrawal agreement. And so this particular quotation here is drawn from the heady days pre-pandemic, you know, where Johnson was giving a speech in Greenwich, and where he likens the UK to a free trade Superman. So to quote Johnson, the UK is ready to take off its Clark Kent spectacles and leap into the phone booth and emerge with its cloak flowing as the supercharged champion of the right of the populations of the earth to buy and sell freely among each other. Wonderful quotation for a presentation. And obviously, you know, I think, you know, from our perspective, this focus on, you know, the UK as a sort of free trading superpower could be seen as puzzling post-Brexit, insofar as, you know, this was not, you know, UK trade policy or trade policy independence was not a key issue during the referendum campaign, right? You know, it wasn't really on the side of the red bus. Paul Cardwell has argued, and I quote, "In the past, the common commercial policy of the EU has not even been a particular bugbear for Eurosceptics," right? So, you know, and similarly, you know, the policy focus is not a reflection of underlying material interests. You know, the economic interests of voters here are a very poor indicator of support for an independent trade policy, insofar as the regions that are most likely to lose out from a hard Brexit are those, you know, that arguably supported Brexit the most. There's evidence to suggest that. You know, when we look at interest group politics, the balance here, you know, bar a few exceptions for obvious reasons, has been a fairly consistent position throughout on, you know, favouring continued alignment with the EU over the new opportunities that an independent trade policy might offer. And the same can be said for the position of most trade unions and NGOs. And similarly, you know, we don't really have a situation here of the structural power of business, right? There's clear evidence of divestment, and yet, in the wake of, you know, a potential hard Brexit, and yet. And so, you have all of this, and on top of it, you know, if we look at actually the substance of UK trade policy so far, you know, the independence, you know, I mean, I know it's early days, but, you know, it's amounted to less than you know, the rhetoric might suggest, you know, the bombastic free trade Superman rhetoric might suggest, insofar as, you know, most of the agenda so far is focused on replicating existing EU agreements. You know, the UK's what's called most favored nation tariff schedule, which is what's applicable to, you know, all WTO members with which it doesn't have a trade, you know, preferential agreement, is also not particularly, you know, it's not the stuff of buccaneering free trade spirit. And so far, actually, in its trade negotiations, notably with the US, it's actually been quite defensive on issues like food safety. You know, so we're left with a puzzle. Why tout this trade policy and then not do very much with it? So this is where we get to performativity, of course. And, you know, on this, I think it's important to stress that, of course, there is some constructivist literature already out there on Brexit that starts giving us some of the answers. You know, the starting point here being to point to the tensions between, on one hand, the sort of, you know, nationalist rhetoric that was often invoked during the referendum campaign, the tension between that and the hyper-globalist policy ideas that, you know, a lot of the sort of drivers of the referendum and of Brexit in the Conservative Party were subscribing to, right? Notably, you know, in a sense that this tension then, you know, means that Brexit counts amongst its supporters both, you know, those who want, you know, more nativist immigration policy and potentially more interventionist, you know, political economy, as well as, you know, those who want to, you know, break free of the EU to be able to, you know, deregulate and pursue a more sort of liberal trade policy. And so, you know, this constructivist literature, I think, provides some answers to sort of, you know, how you can reconcile these tensions, you know, insofar as the ideas expressed around sovereignty were ambiguous, you know, they were emotive, and they, you know, managed to undermine the technocratic depoliticization, you know, reliant on expertise that I think had characterized much of the, you know, British political debate around the EU, and certainly when it comes to trade policy. But of course, the referendum campaign is not the same thing as the government having to formulate a concrete policy. And, you know, when it comes to, you know, although it might be easy in a referendum campaign to reconcile these sort of, you know, different positions, you know, by staying ambiguous, that's much more difficult when you have to translate out into specific policy proposals. And so this is, you know, this is not a natural terrain for trade policy, given, you know, it actually, you know, means potentially some, you know, hard trade-offs, right? You know, in terms of the hard Brexit that's being delivered, or in terms of, you know, watering down of food standards, etc. So, you know, the question, you know, one might pose is the one that's, you know, point number one on the slide, which is why put such an emphasis on an independent trade policy if you're trying to reconcile nationalist and hyper-globalist tendencies within Brexit post-referendum? And, you know, our view here is that actually what we need to do is think about the UK's trade policy through the lens of performativity. And there has been another paper that has talked about Brexit through a performativity lens, notably the paper by Adler, Nissen et al. Ours is more specifically focused on trade policy, but we also sort of take this view of performativity as layered, which you know, is an idea we also find in the IP literature on performativity. Sorry, the international political economy literature on performativity. So to keep things simple, effectively what we're talking about here is, you know, two different types of performativity. One, which you might call self-enacting or Austinian, is about where you have a speech act or a device such as a financial model being self-enacting, causing what it describes to happen. So in the case of UK trade policy, pursuing an independent trade policy brings about a hard Brexit as it necessitates exiting the customs union and the single market. And this shifts the emphasis of the discussion away from, you know, the potential economic benefits, or in this case, costs of a hard Brexit, and onto the automatic, you know, self-enacting, you know, by virtue of the fact that, you know, you're doing it, sovereignty dividend of Brexit, which is, you know, an independent trade policy, right? No matter what the economic costs of Brexit are, you don't have to focus on those. You can just talk about how you've regained your sovereignty because you have this independent trade policy, this new competence. And then the second sort of layer of performativity that we're interested in is this idea of generic performativity, which is often associated with the work of Judith Butler, and which is described by Donald Mackenzie as highlighting the, and I quote, "the categories of social life are not self-standing, natural, or to be taken as given, but are the result of endless performances by human beings and by non-human entities and artifacts as well." And so, you know, when it comes to this idea of performance through, of performativity through repeated performance, you know, what you have as trade policy is the fact that you can just have endless negotiations. You know, you can just keep talking, and, you know, you're exercising your trade policy competence. You know, the sovereignty is in action, and you don't actually have to agree on anything. You just, and this is something, you know, which means that trade policy is uniquely placed, I think, to sort of, you know, allow for a performance of Brexit. So in effect, you know, what we're saying here is that a performative trade policy works to bridge the gap between nationalist and hyper-globalist Brexit visions by allowing trade policy to become an end in itself, sovereignty, which is repeatedly performed, rather than a means to an end, which might cause problems and, you know, clashes between the sort of different factions in the coalition for Brexit. You know, if you were going to pursue liberalization of agriculture, for example, in the context of a trade policy, then that would, you know, pit different factions, pro-Brexit factions against each other. And so, you know, the rest of my presentation, I want to focus on illustrating this by looking at 4 areas, 5 time, of UK trade policy. The first 2 examining the sort of Austinian or self-enacting performativity. In the case of, first of all, the UK's negotiations and subsequent agreement with the EU, right, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which was finalized on, was it Christmas Eve? Yeah, if I remember correctly. But also the way in which the UK is sort of, or the government has been touting its sort of newly gained seat at the WTO. I mean, the UK was obviously previously also represented at the WTO, but of course, you know, subordinate to the European Union's representation. But now, you know, of course, it has its own independent seat, which I think also reflects that self-enacting performativity. And then turning to the sort of generic performativity, we, I think, see this reflected, or at least I focus on two dynamics here. The way in which the so-called replication, or what's called rollover, of EU trade agreements has been turned into sort of a way of touting, you know, rather than being a policy problem that was caused by Brexit, you know, how do we make sure that we still benefit from these EU trade agreements? It's now seen as a sort of advantage. Oh, look at how many trade agreements we've negotiated. And the second way is how the UK government, when talking about new trade agreements, likes to emphasize the benefits of the agreements with new partners, but glosses over the trade-offs involved. And in this case, we're talking about the US, and in this presentation, I'll be talking about the US and India. Okay, so let's turn to the first issue, the first empirical sort of part of the presentation, which is, you know, this one way in which the UK has been enacting this this Austinian performativity in the case of the negotiations with the EU, where, you know, an independent trade policy here means, you know, having to go for a hard Brexit, and then going for, you know, a minimalist agreement with the EU. So, you know, crucially, you know, what the UK government in its negotiations with the EU, and we'll get to the agreement in the next slide, but in the negotiations has consistently emphasized is the importance of sovereignty over market access, both in terms of, as I was mentioning, the choice of the type of agreement to go for, right? So, you know, although Boris Johnson liked to call this a comprehensive Canada-style free trade agreement, you know, if we look at the so-called, you know, Barnier ladder of doom, right? It's quite near the bottom in terms of level of integration, right? So the premise being here that, you know, the UK, you know, with this sort of agreement with the EU would have greater power to diverge on regulatory matters. And secondly, throughout the negotiations, it's also resisted the EU's insistence that the agreement feature provisions on the so-called level playing field, i.e., you know, providing for non-regression on some issues like environmental and labor market regulation, and, you know, something a bit more constraining, which was, you know, dynamic alignment on state aid regulation. And from the EU perspective, this sort of level playing field was seen as a precondition for granting, you know, extensive market access, as there was a fear that the UK could undercut EU standards in these areas, and its producers there could you know, compete unfairly with the EU producers. Crucially, this policy stance has not been justified in terms of the economic benefits, because that's quite difficult, but also not in terms of the specific benefits of diverging. You know, and I know a lot of commentators, I think, try and read, you know, a lot of sort of, you know, interventionism into sort of, for example, the desire not to, you know, follow EU rules on state aid. We don't need to get into that debate, but, you know, it's interesting that this has not been the sort of core justification. The core justification, the way it's been presented, is as a way of sort of, you know, reasserting sovereignty to core. You know, it's all just about, you know, the UK being sovereign. So you have David Frost, I think, summing it up here when he says that, you know, and I quote, "We bring to the negotiations not some clever tactical positioning, but the fundamentals of what it means to be an independent country." And so turning to the content of the trade and cooperation agreement, which I resisted reading over the Christmas holidays, I have to say. I needed a rest, and this massive document was not a source of relaxation in any case. So turning to that, I think we see these dynamics play out in the content of the agreement as well. You know, which is presented, at least domestically in the UK, you know, as a big win for UK sovereignty. So in the foreword to the government summary of the agreement, Boris Johnson writes, and I quote, "Most importantly, the agreement provides for the UK to take back control of our laws, affording no role for EU law and no jurisdiction for the European Court of Justice. While we made our fair share of compromises during the negotiations, we never wavered from the goal of restoring national sovereignty, the central purpose of leaving the EU." And if you go to the guidance, which is, you know, obviously written by civil servants, you know, although the tone's more legalistic, you get a similar sort of message. And I quote, "The agreement is based on international law, not EU law. There's no role for the European Court of Justice and no requirements for the UK to continue following EU law." Right. So if we home in then on the provisions when it comes to the level playing field, which was sort of key bone of contention, I think, you know, my reading of it is two things that are important from this perspective of performativity and emphasizing sovereignty. First of all, that when we look at enforcement, this is subject exclusively to a bilateral arbitration panel. And here the UK has actually obtained a concession from the EU that there's no referral to the European Court of Justice when it comes to matters of interpretation of EU law. You know, EU law is also not the basis for provisions in the agreement. Which leads me to the second point, which is the content of the level playing field, which involves a rebalancing mechanism, you know, rather than dynamic alignment, which allows to, revisiting of the rules if one of the parties is unhappy with the balance of obligations. And, you know, on issues like state aid, you know, mentions some specific principles rather than, you know, the specifics of EU law, although the specific principles, of course, are not too dissimilar to EU law. And so the point is that, you know, if one of the parties is unhappy with the rebalancing, they can, you know, after some time, you know, following a process, you know, suspend preferences. So, you know, if we look at this, you know, and also the delay that led to this agreement, right? It was a last-minute agreement, you know, days before, you know, the withdrawal agreement transition period was about to expire. Obviously, that delay is performative as well, allows you to present these things as a big concession. But, you know, most importantly, from my perspective, is the fact that, you know, we get this sovereignty for market access trade-off kind of playing out. So for the EU, of course, the key concern was that the UK did not undercut EU standards in areas like state aid while continuing to benefit from market access. And I think these provisions are there basically to, you know, the rebalancing provisions, for example, are there to make sure that this concern is assuaged. So it's perhaps less of a big win for the UK. It's only a big win if you focus on the sort of symbolic gain of saying you're sovereign and no longer subject to international rules, but it comes at a cost, which is market access. And so, you know, we come back to this idea of, you know, self-enacting sovereignty, you know, through these sorts of, you know, in this case, somewhat bespoke mechanisms. The other way, and I promise this slide is briefer and less technical, the other way in which, you know, the UK has, you know, been able to sort of play on this sort of self-enacting sovereignty, self-enacting performativity when it comes to sovereignty is in the context of its independent seat at the WTO. Well, I mean, I shouldn't put it in, you know, it is, you know, technically independent insofar as the UK is no longer part of the customs union or the single market and so on. But it's interesting that the UK government likes to sort of tout the sort of importance of the WTO at a time when, you know, a lot of commentators would say that, you know, as an organization, it's being marginalized in the global governance of trade for a variety of reasons. In any case, what we have here is a quotation from Liz Truss from a press release, you know, where, you know, this is from October 2019. So this is while the UK was still a member of the European Union, of course, and thus, you know, it had a seat in the WTO, but still subordinate officially to the UK, so to the European Union. And so, you know, Liz Truss, you know, speaking in anticipation of the UK leaving the European Union officially in 2020, says that after 46 years, Britain is on the verge of taking back control of its trade policy, and we will take its own seat at the table. We live in an increasingly protectionist world, and it is vitally important now more than ever that Britain and other WTO members fly the flag for free trade. Okay. And then after, so this tweet I've got here on the right is from February 2020. So this is after the UK has officially left the EU, but is still technically part of the customs union and, you know, the single market. So really, you know, doesn't have, you know, can't just, you know, pursue a completely independent policy yet, in theory. We have Liz Truss again touting the sort of now formally, but in practice not yet fully independent seat. Now, you know, that's not to say that, of course, the situation now is different, and, you know, the UK is no longer, you know, in the transition period and has a looser FTA with the EU. But it's interesting how quickly, in this instance, the government was keen to stress, you know, the sort of formal trappings of sovereignty, even though in practice, you know, it wasn't yet, you know, shot of the single market and customs union. Okay, another. Now we turn to this. So I've talked about self-enacting performativity, right? this next section is all about, the way in which trade policy is a repeated performance and allows the UK to repeatedly sort of tout the benefits of, having an independent trade policy. This is obviously emphasized, this is sort of, best exemplified, I think, by the emphasis that the UK government, placed on negotiating with multiple partners. And both Theresa May and Johnson's governments have made much hay, made much hay of the fact that even under the withdrawal agreement, there was a little footnote that allowed them to go off and, during the transition period, negotiate their own trade agreements, even though, they were still subject to EU law during this period. And, of course, under the common commercial policy, in theory, you're not allowed to run off and do your own trade agreements. In any case, what's interesting when we turn to negotiation of trade agreements is that the government is already touting the negotiating prowess of the UK, for example, this is a line that's been repeated elsewhere, but in a statement to Parliament on the 2nd of March, Liz Truss, the Trade Secretary, said that the UK government was helping exporters make the most of, and I quote, 64 trade deals we have done to date to sell more around the world, including fast-growing markets in the Americas and Asia Pacific. And I also had the misfortune of having to listen to a radio advertisement, which was sort of, again, making a similar sort of claim. In any case, the point is, 64 trade deals sounds great, doesn't it? And the UK has only just left the European Union. Wow. But if we dig in a little bit, first of all, it's not 64 trade deals. It's trade agreements covering 64 partners. Okay, sounds a bit like a semantic difference. Obviously certain trade agreements cover multiple partners, right? But secondly, and this I think is the more important point, a lot of these agreements, in fact, I think all of these agreements are just rollovers of existing EU agreements. In other words, what was previously pitched as a real problem of Brexit, in the trade policy context, which is that, the UK would no longer be party to a series of trade agreements that the UK government, that the European Union had negotiated, and thus would lose market access opportunities across the world. And necessitated, obviously, a sort of bit of catch-up work to renegotiate these agreements, or at least roll them over for a bilateral context. That was seen as a problem because the UK government, of course, had to conduct a lot of negotiations there in a short period of time. That and the fact that the UK government has been able to do that in a number of cases, although not for all agreements, has now been presented as a real strength. It's been instrumentalized to sort of make this point about, the repeated performance of sovereignty and how successful that performance of sovereignty has been, even though these agreements are not entirely new. And so to give you an example, or to give you a visual representation of this, I thought I'd sort of compare on the left-hand side what you have is UK FTAs, but both of these are from the end of 2020, so they're not fully up to date. But so on the left you have, the UK's FTAs, on the right you have the EU's free trade agreements. And what you can see here is of the concluded agreements highlighted on the left, which are in green, none is with a partner that the EU did not already have an agreement in place with, which are given in red, dark blue, and aquamarine on the right map. And you can see that, if you compare the two. And moreover, these although you're obviously talking about new agreements in the sense that of course they're new legal instruments. In most cases, these agreements, these agreements have basically been focused on ensuring continuity rather than sort of coming up, with an entirely new set of provisions. And in this respect, actually, one very important or interesting example is the UK-Japan agreement. Important because, of course, Japan is a big trade partner, but also interesting because it sparked a bit of controversy involving the Great British Bake Off with this tweet. So this tweet basically is suggesting that because of the UK-Japan FTA, UK importers can, UK consumers can benefit from the elimination of tariffs on soy sauce. But of course, that was already the case under the EU-Japan FTA, which, the EU benefited from when it was a member or, during the transition period. So a little bit misleading, to say the least. Now, that's not to say that, there aren't some new provisions. In the case of Japan FTA, of course, there's a new provisions on digital services and data protection, which could be seen as gains from a pro-liberalization sense. When it comes to other rollover agreements, involving Mexico and Canada, there's been an agreement to review them and talk about further liberalization. But important to stress that in some ways, actually, these continuity agreements go less far than the existing EU agreements, insofar as for example, when it comes to tariff preferences under the existing agreements, certain goods, under the new agreements, certain goods might no longer be eligible for tariff-free treatment because while the UK has managed to agree what's called extended accumulation provisions in some of its FTA, which allows EU content in UK goods bound for export to the partner, for example, Japan, to benefit from originating status, and thus making it easier for them to qualify for tariff concessions. UK content in EU goods under its FTAs, under the FTAs that the EU has with that partner is no longer counted. So, you probably struggled to follow me there potentially. And that's the problem, really, which is that, the devil in all of these things is in the detail. And, the detail's lost when you can just talk about trade deals with 64 partners. Right. So I know I'm a bit behind for time, but hopefully I've got enough time to go and talk a little bit about, the sort of generic performativity or performance of trade policy when it comes to new trade partners. And, obviously the big sort of priority for the UK government for a long time has been a trade agreement with the US. Obviously that's attracted quite a bit of attention. And from a government perspective, this is sort of seen as a big win from Brexit. So when the negotiations were launched in March 2020, the Trade Secretary emphasized, both the principles behind the general policy, of negotiating FTAs and the merits of trade openness, right? So you've got the quotation here of that. But if you look at the actual practice of the negotiations, I think it's fair to say that the UK government has been much more cautious. So turning, for example, if we look at its negotiating objectives on the issue of sanitary and phytosanitary standards, which is one of the key impediments to US agricultural exports to the EU and the UK. There's a commitment to uphold high levels of protection, which is potentially incompatible with an ambitious agreement with the US, given that the US consistently, and this is not just the Trump era things, goes back to the TTIP days, has been concerned about, things like the ban on chlorinated chicken imports affecting its agricultural producers. And this cautiousness and, the UK's continued defensiveness on agriculture, also potentially reflects tensions within the Conservative Party. Katie Ball's, was written an interesting piece here in June of 2020, which talks about the split in the Conservative Party between, this is journalistic simplification here, but I think it's useful, to kind of give a sense between little free marketeers in former red wall seats that are keen on free trade to reduce prices, and so-called Waitrose conservatives keen on protecting farmers, anxious of having to compete with producers subject to lower standards. So again, here with the US, it looks like the UK government's going through the motions of negotiating, it's a performance, but not really agreeing to very much. When we turn to India, which is sort of, I think, always been on the sort of radar, but also I think has gained a bit of prominence more recently, you get similar sort of dynamic. So what you've got here is a little headline from The Sun. If you read this, headline, you'd think, wow, what's, great achievement there, Liz Truss, on your recent visit in February 2020 to India. You've agreed you've got a new trade agreement, the enhanced trade partnership. I'm not even going to get into the sort of problematic side of the headline, which is, the reference to England and trade gains for England, given that, it's the UK government that's responsible for trade policy. But if you read the fine print, in this case, the joint statement from Liz Truss and the Minister of Commerce and Industry of India, Shri Piyush Goyal, actually, the outcome of the meeting is a little less impressive than, a new trade deal. So to quote, taking forward their commitment from the 14th UK-India Joint Economic and Trade Committee on 24th of July 2020, India and UK trade ministers reviewed the ongoing engagement between the two sides for an enhanced trade partnership as part of the development of a roadmap that would lead to a potential comprehensive FTA, including considerations on an interim agreement on preferential basis. So what we're effectively talking about here is a roadmap to an FTA, not an FTA. And the other thing, of course, that the headlines won't tell you is that it was actually the UK government that was one of the chief obstacles in the EU-India negotiations of the late 2000s, early 2010s over the issue of what's called Mode 4 services delivery. Now, without getting into all the technical detail, in a nutshell, what was going on was that the Home Office was not keen on liberalizing the visa regime for Indian professionals to come to work in the UK on a temporary basis. And, in other words, here what you have is a performance of the negotiations without necessarily a willingness to engage on this issue. And given the sort of rhetoric around immigration these days, I wonder how much the UK government would be willing to give on this. Similarly, what in reference to this recent visit to India, the newspaper headline in the UK government press release touting the visit also seemed to elide is or not sufficiently differentiate between is formal trade agreements, which of course the UK wasn't able to negotiate pre-Brexit, and market access and trade and investment promotion work, such as that, that in this case was associated with the visit and led to the sort of jobs figures that are quoted here in the Sun story. So market access work effectively involves having bilateral discussions with governments on eliminating trade barriers without necessarily enshrining those in a trade agreement. And trade investment promotion work is basically, as the name suggests, about promoting, in this case, UK exports or the UK as an investment destination. And yet, you have these sorts of tools, which in a sense were there before, being presented as a sort of boon of Brexit. So once again, what we have here is a sort of repeated performance of Brexit through negotiations without engaging with the potential pitfalls. In this case, the issue of Mode 4, I'm sure, is going to come up or would come up. And we also have the presentation of pre-Brexit, policy tools that were available pre-Brexit, in the case of investment and trade promotion and market access work, as something radically new. So, Demetrius will be happy to know this is the final slide. I hopefully haven't gone over too much in terms of my time. But in terms of, what I've set out to do in this presentation, the aim was to address the question of why an independent trade policy, has become so important, at least in the discourse, to the UK government's Brexit project post-referendum, insofar as this was not a key part of the referendum campaign or a key Eurosceptic demand in the years leading up to the campaign. There was really no clear material interest for it. And, despite, with the tool now in hand, the UK government has been quite non-committal, despite all its bombastic rhetoric about the UK's buccaneering spirit and its potential role as a free trade superman. So the argument that I've put forward here is that an independent trade policy helps to smooth tensions in the Brexit project between nationalism and globalism through a layered performativity. So, in a sense, an independent trade policy operates much like a self-enacting speech act, even when the content is not defined and its economic value is therefore dubious. It delivers a clear sovereignty dividend in terms of, for example, the negotiations with the EU, but also in terms of, taking up that independent seat at the WTO. And similarly, it can exist, again, devoid of any new, as in the case of, or not much new, in the case of, the EU FTAs that have been rolled over, or detailed content through repeated performance, right? So the multiple negotiations on rolling over EU FTAs, presenting, pre-Brexit policy tools such as investment and trade promotion as new, or, the sort of, repeated performances of negotiation with the US and, potentially in the future also with India without necessarily, committing very much on the policy content and making potentially politically tricky trade-offs. Of course, this does beg the question, in my view, of how long such an underperformance can be sustained, particularly when hard Brexit starts to bite. And here, I think what's interesting is that, of course, there's been some recent talk about the UK delaying customs checks to facilitate food imports from the EU, which is, of course, not something that the EU is reciprocating, which is hardly the stuff of a sort of confident, independent trade power. So, this sort of, performance of independence, may eventually, start to bite a lot more. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. I'll stop sharing as well. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Gabe. That was excellent. I'll just as Catherine collects questions from the audience, I cannot resist but asking the first one. It's traditional, So thank you again. I thought it was excellent. I think that we all agree that Brexit or the consequences, the economic consequences of Brexit is more likely to be a slow burner, in the sense that we haven't seen a major crisis yet, economic crisis yet, but we are kind of, or most of us are certain that the implications of Brexit will spread out over time. But in fairness, I'm not entirely sure what kind of indicators should we be looking at to prove the point either way. In other words, if I was to ask you, give me 3 or 4 key indicators over the next 3 to 5 years that will give me a very good understanding of whether this has gone horribly wrong, has gone okay, or it has gone swimmingly. Which indicators would these be? I mean, what we should be looking at?
Should I answer that question and then? Yeah. Okay, great. No, it's a really good question. I mean, of course, this week there's a lot of media attention on the sort of export figures, right? I mean, it doesn't help that COVID, of course, has happened, in the intervening period, and that kind of, probably helps the government mask the impact of Brexit to an extent. But this is the thing, right? If it's a slow burner, as things like divestment are, also divestment, a lot of it is about investments that don't get made, right? So it's not just offshoring, but it's actually people deciding not to invest in that non-decision is very hard to catalog. But I guess this is part of the problem insofar as it's hard to disentangle these effects, whether it's a slow burner or whether it's not. I mean, I think what's been interesting in a sense is actually in a sense here how the export figures look pretty bad actually, but in a sense. The problem is it doesn't really matter politically because you can just say this was not about economic gain, it's about reclaiming our sovereignty, and in a sense that's much more black and white than than figures that other people are going to sort of argue about. That's the kind of the strength of this sort of performative narrative, is that you can kind of rehash it, and you can say, oh, who cares about the numbers? It's all about, our
But there are numbers. I mean, you have mentioned both the trade balance, which we can, I guess, trace over time. And we can also measure the FDI flows into the UK. So it is measurable.
Yes, I mean, indeed. But I guess the point I would make is this, like, numbers are very abstract. I mean, this is part of the problem of the referendum campaign, right? The numbers and figures, are very abstract, Where it starts becoming trickier is, if, all of a sudden people find empty supermarket shelves, right? So if it sort of starts, being felt as much more real. And, the issue here, of course, is that the UK hasn't introduced the full raft of import checks yet. So, effectively, the fact that it's thinking, or this talk about waiving or pushing, back the imposition of that, suggests a certain concern with the impact that this can have, in a very sort of obvious and visual way. I think the government cares more about that, than it does about, the figures, because, it can just, point to sort of, the sorts of arguments it's always made about the figures. And interestingly, when it comes to the UK's trade policy, okay, they of course have an economist unit and they generate, statistical analyses and so on, but that's not the sort of emphasis of the sort of narrative about the independent trade policy. The emphasis is on, look at how great Britain is flying the flag for free trade, look at, we're a sovereign power once again, So yeah, that would be my point. I mean, I think you could have a reasoned sort of, academic discussion about the impacts, of Brexit. And then even then you couldn't fully disentangle what's COVID, what's Brexit, what's this, what's that. We all know what the direction of travel is, but politically, I think it's more about what the sort of, when once it's starting to be felt on the ground, in effect. I think that's much more important.
Thanks, Gabe. I'm just going to bring in some of the questions now. I have some of my own, but I won't abuse my power because we've got quite a lot of questions that have come through. So the first one, I'll give you the few that have come through and give you time to respond to them. So the first one is, in what way does this performative Brexit trade policy illustrate the potential new cleavages in defining British politics? So what are those kind of new cleavages going to be in British politics as we move forward? And obviously how that plays in as well to public opinion and politics. there's kind of, I'm going to lump these, it's one question, but we talked a bit about, you're kind of looking at the USA as a case study. And one comment here is that, well, maybe the Irish issue, and when I think what this person means by the Irish issue is the case of Northern Ireland and the Northern Irish Protocol, and how that plays into things. But do you see that stopping the USA trading with the UK and developing a trade policy with the UK? And linked to that as well, this person is interested to know how the government has increased business tax by 25% and how this will affect the small to medium-sized businesses negatively during this time. So again, you know, there's two separate things here, isn't it? We've got the kind of COVID environment that we're all living in, but we're also trying to get to grips with this new independent trade policy as well. And I suppose it's maybe unpicking that. And the last question I'll give you for the moment, and then we'll come back to another round, is that also someone is also interested in the role you think the media plays in all of this. So thinking of headlines of, say, X company moves production of X to X location in Britain. Do you think this is going to build into this kind of construction of Britain as the independent global trading nation as a result of Brexit? So I'll give you those. We've got a couple of more, but I'll just give you a few minutes on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great questions. And apologies, I'm sort of going to riff a bit off the questions because there's quite a lot, and I do want to, you know, sort of address each of them rather than sort of, you know, taking 5 minutes to come up with a response. So the first question was about, you know, how this fits into the new cleavages, and I think I gave some hints in terms of the presentation where that fits. I mean, in a sense, what the presentation is trying to argue is that there's important cleavages in the sort of pro-Brexit coalition, as it were, you know, and you know what you know, this performance of trade policy allows you to do is to kind of, you know, not have to deal with those and not have to split up your coalition. And specifically talking about, you know, the UK government, you know, I think, you know, you'll remember this sort of slide where I cited the article from Katie Balls, you know, where she talks about divisions within the Conservative Party between, you know, those, you know, with close links to sort of agricultural interests, which are obviously quite anxious about agricultural trade liberalization, and, you know, the so-called sort of, you know, red wall, you know, conservatives, you know, who see in global Britain as a way of, you know, of reducing prices. Although, of course, you know, if you'd ask an economist, they'd probably tell you that effect of trade agreements is much exaggerated. So those are some. Of course, it's also in, you know, you have that Remain Leave cleavage, right? You know, for the Leave side, you know, this is, you know, constant fodder, right? You know, look at the great sort of independence of the UK and look what it can do with its newfound sovereignty. You know, whereas from the Remain side, you know, you get the rehash of the arguments about economic losses and so on. So, you know, in a sense, I think it effectively, you know, allows the government to kind of keep replaying the referendum, and, you know, and it's constant grievance politics, you know, that's what it is. That's the problem. You know, someone who likes to engage with the policy substance, I sometimes have to tear my hair out. Anyway, just make for good papers, hopefully. On the Irish issue, right? Of course, you know, the protocol is the one exception when it comes to, say, the application of EU law, of course, because, you know, as we know, Northern Ireland is effectively in the EU customs territory and single market for goods. So and how that plays out with the US, I mean, I think, you know, of course, there's been a lot of talk about, you know, Biden taking a very different position, you know, obviously, you know, not wishing to endanger the Good Friday Agreement, etc. I mean, I think, you know, what's important to stress with the current administration is that for them, you know, negotiating new trade agreements, I think, is less of a priority. You know, there's also the optics of, you know, negotiating with Brexit Britain. You know, and also, you know, as I was saying earlier, let's not forget, you know, all those issues that, you know, I mentioned, you know, earlier. Well, I didn't talk about them in detail, but something like SPS, for example, sanitary, you know, that's a sort of consistent line, whether you're Biden, whether you're, you know, Trump, whether you're Obama, you know, you're getting pressure from your agricultural sector that, you know, you want, you know, access, you know, and you want some, you know, you want some movement on that. And, you know, Biden will get the same. And if, you know, if he goes for an FTA with even if he went for an FTA with the UK, it wouldn't really go anywhere if you didn't get much movement on that, I think. So, yeah. I think, there's a combination, of factors there. And I think, the situation of Ireland is one issue, but, you could in theory have an agreement that just covered GB, of course. And then on the issue of business tax, and I'm not really an expert on corporation tax and taxation policy, but on SMEs, what I would say is that, there's generally been a sort of policy discourse, in the context of the WTO, the EU, also to an extent the UK, about the benefits for SMEs of trade policy, right? And indeed, I think when Liz Truss, for example, talks about the 64 trade deals, and I hear these radio adverts, these are about SMEs, right? Targeting SMEs. But of course, the problem is, to be able to benefit from trade agreements, just even to benefit from tariff concessions, there's a whole lot of paperwork you need to fill in, to sort of, for example, prove the originating status of your goods, right? To prove that, the goods have sufficient UK content to qualify for the preferences under the agreement. And that gets all really messy. And at the same time, as an SME, you're kind of all of a sudden, facing a situation with the EU where previously you had pretty much no paperwork. And now you have mountains and mountains of paper. Twitter is full of, people taking pictures of the amounts of paperwork they now have to fill in, if they're exporting goods to the EU, particularly if they're goods of of animal origin. So, yeah, the performative trade policy, it works in terms of, touting the benefits for SMEs, but, if on the ground, it's again, doesn't really deliver. And how the media plays into this. So I think the question was specifically about, investment and how, investment decisions are presented, right? So yeah, the point I was trying to make in the presentation is about the policy tool of investment promotion, which of course, was something that was always in the toolbox, even with EU membership, right? EU member states go around and, their investment promotion agencies do their own investment promotion, often in competition with other member states, despite the fact that the EU obviously, under the Common Commercial Policy, negotiates on FDI. But in this sense, I think, there is a sort of clear, there's an eye on the media clearly here, because, you can present investment promotion work, as in this case with India in the presentation, as a big win for Britain, So, yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think it lends itself to good mediatization, and and at the same time, you can then sort of claim, well, all that evidence about divestment and so on, it's just anecdotal. Look at who's come and invested, or look at all the jobs that Liz Truss has gotten for us on her recent visit to India, and that's the problem.
Super, thank you. I've got kind of 3 more questions and a question / comment, and then we'll probably have to wrap up. But I feel like we could be here all day, which is phenomenal. And it shows the quality and interest around your paper, but also the research area as well. So Niall has asked, he's got 2 questions if he's allowed, and he is allowed. So the first one he wants to ask is, what do you think would attribute, as you mentioned at the start of your presentation, to the failure of interest groups, kind of broadly defined, to influence the government's position to one closer to their preferred outcome? And secondly, he wants to know whether this kind of performativity is visible in trade policy of other countries as well. The third and kind of final one then is, in terms of new trade attitudes, what do you think the UK's policy approach to the Asian trade region and countries would be? So do you see increased trade and cooperation, kind of more towards Southeast Asia, to the loss and kind of the EU? And Craig Berry said that it's a fantastic paper, Gabe. His question and comments focus specifically on the internal Conservative Party politics, which is something I wanted to ask you on. And he says that trade policy discourse works politically because they're walking the tightrope between the free trade and protectionism that the Conservatives have in the UK. But he says that it seems likely the only issue that can derail this in the current circumstances is internal Conservative Party politics, because largely, a lot of Conservative Party members now are strongly ideologically committed on both sides of the trade debate. And this has been evident in that trade sovereignty dilemma. And he talks about Katie Bull, kind of what she flags up has always been there, but perhaps now it's more intense. And I suppose if I could add on to that, so I am going to abuse my power a little bit here, but I suppose, when you know, when does this become damaging to the Conservative Party, to the current government? Because this is something as well that, you know, is going to be long term, isn't it? You know, you've said throughout your presentation that this is something that is not probably going to be tied up in the next government and next. So what happens at the next election? How does this filter through to there? And I say, how damaging could this be for the Conservative Party, but also then kind of the UK longer term potentially? Thanks, Gabe.
Wow, fantastic questions. I mean, really great, and you know, good points to think about. Turning to Niall's first couple of questions. Failure of interest group politics to influence the government. I mean, you know, this is the big puzzle, which is the starting point for our paper. And of course, you know, it's not the focus of our paper, but so my reading of the situation effectively, you know, a lot of people have talked about, effectively, you know, that the government, you know, is committed to a particular policy line, and is effectively only interested in, you know, evidence and arguments that sort of feed into that, right? So, you know, instead of evidence-based policy, it's policy-based evidence. So, you know, and this is the story here, right? Effectively, you know, the current, you know, Conservative Party, you know, the current members of the, prominent politicians in the Conservative Party, you know, have cut their teeth in the Brexit referendum, have a very clearly defined position on this. You know, are living off the grievance politics of Brexit. And, you know, that's that, you know, I mean, you know, it doesn't, you know, if you don't feed into that sort of overarching narrative, and, you know, what was really problematic actually is that in the early days, you know, that narrative became established that Brexit has to equal hard Brexit. And then, of course, once that's established, it becomes very difficult to sort of counteract that. And, you know, effectively a party that, you know, in the past had perhaps been seen as quite close to business, you know, of course, the sort of ideological composition of that party has shifted as well. You know, all of a sudden, you know, the sort of businesses that were making those arguments were seen as sort of, you know, and were painted as sort of vested interest, you know, in the sort of public choice sense, you know. So yeah, it's all about how the sort of narrative has been framed, right? And in that sort of context, it's very difficult for you to sort of, you know, come and make the case, you know, once Brexit is painted as, you know, the only real Brexit is a hard Brexit, which gives us an independent trade policy and control of our borders and, you know, whatever else, you know, anything that isn't that, you know, doesn't fly. That would be my sort of, you know, view. I mean, I'm a constructivist, so, you know, I would kind of stress that, wouldn't I? You know, what's also sort of been undermined, of course, is the sort of value of expertise, you know, and, you know, as a critic of certain forms of technocracy and, you know, the sort of depoliticization surrounding expertise, you know, of course, you know, I think it's important to stress that expertise is not apolitical, but, you know, the sort of, you know, I think denigration of rigorous debate is problematic. In terms of performativity in other countries, of course, you know, you know, we're not suggesting that this is entirely unique to the UK. You know, the EU, of course, also, you know, has, you know, in response to the claim that it was a laggard when it came to negotiating, you know, has also made claims, you know, about the success of negotiating and so on. But I think, you know, at least from what I observe, you know, in the sort of trade policy I'm familiar with, I think what you have in the UK is a trade policy that's almost only performative. So, you know, there's very little substance there. You know, I mean, you know, in terms of policy terms, it's, you know, it's replicating EU agreements and it's making statements on this and that. And of course, you know, the big sort of policy substance is the hard Brexit, right? And the agreement that then entails with the EU. But beyond that, that's the whole point, I think. It's quite unique in that sense. Yeah, so that would be my point. I think, you know, performativity finds its way into the trade policy of other countries, but is, I think, overwhelming in the case of the post-Brexit UK. Question on Asia. So I think, you know, again, you know, this is really interesting because I remember early on in the Brexit debate, you know, this idea was floated that the UK would join the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we all laughed at the time. And, you know, because of course the UK isn't in the Pacific, right? Pitcairn Islands. But there we are, that's official government policy now. And, you know, again, you know, easy to put a performativity lens on it. And I think we're gonna probably have a chapter, you know, that talks about this in part as well in the book. You know, the way this is presented is, oh, you know, this is the new center of growth. You know, the UK, you know, is embracing its free trade vocation, this is, instead of, being bound by geography, it's embracing, the new trade in services and, 3D printing and the possibilities of technology and whatever else you want to talk about. And of course, there's some, affinities here also with, certain Anglospherist discourses as well, that come into play, particularly in relation to Australia and New Zealand. My point is simply that, this is again performance, because of course, these trade partners are of course less important than the European Union is. But the European Union is a dirty word in UK trade policy. So Craig, you've obviously written on this in the past, so your comment is really useful, and I think I think the sort of lineage of this tension, I think, is something we definitely would want to bring out. Yeah, I do wonder, is this going to derail it or not? I mean, you could sustain this kind of performance for a while. The only area where I think you can't sustain it, and this sort of goes down to, or is me addressing your question, Catherine, is when it comes to the consequences of hard Brexit with, not in terms of, abstract statistics, but empty shelves in the supermarket, or, loads of companies going out of business, etc., particularly SMEs. So, that's where the performativity starts falling apart. It's, you can keep negotiating all you want and not get anywhere and not have to make any hard choices or come up with sort of very limited FTAs. But where it really starts to bite is in hard Brexit. And, the UK, of course, is not self-sufficient when it comes to food, right? And the UK is very dependent on food imports from the European Union, which is not surprising, but given, 40 plus years of membership plus transition period. But yeah, so this is where I think there is more of a pressure point. But we'll see. I mean, I thought, Dominic Cummings' little escapade would have more political repercussions than it did. And yet, here we are. This grievance politics, which also manifests itself in the case of, performative trade policy, is the gift that keeps on giving. So let's see.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm aware of time. We are a little bit over, but it was a really interesting paper and a very good discussion that followed. Let me take this opportunity to thank Gabe for his talk. I thought it was great. Just to remind everybody that we will resume in 2 weeks' time with Othon Anastasakis from St. Anthony's College, Oxford, where we will be changing the subject somehow, talking about Turkey and Russia and their influence in the Balkans. Also very, very important for us. Just to remind our participants that in the 12th of, I think it's the 12th of April, we will be hosting our annual lecture where the EU ambassador to London will come and speak to us. So we will be circulating our publicity shortly, and we do hope that we'll see as many of you as possible again. So thanks, Gabe, and thanks for everybody for attending. Thanks to everybody for attending.
Thanks, Gabe. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Real pleasure.